This is background and information for Chapter 4, Adult and Teacher Development, and also some points to consider for supervision. Chapter 4 is rather lengthy and there's a lot of material, so I'm just going to give some of the highlights in these PowerPoint slides, and then I encourage you to take time to go back through the chapter to get additional detail. So, some of the people included in the chapter, there's Howard Gardner, Multiple Intelligences, Robert Sternberg, and also Malcolm Knowles. There's an additional resource in Canvas for Malcolm Knowles. Andragogy, the term, should sound familiar to pedagogy. Pedagogy, think of ped, like pediatric, is about children. Andragogy is for adults. So this is the theory of learning that applies to adults, since as a leader you will be working with adults and you need to consider their various characteristics. So I think Malcolm Knowles is very important. The idea to be self-directing, that we want to know what we're doing and have that consideration to move forward. You do have experience, you need to acknowledge that. This need to solve real-world problems, and then performance-centered application. Most staff development or learning teachers appreciate when they can take something out of it right away and it immediately becomes useful to them in what they're working on. Additional learning skills, think about experiential learning. You can look through this material. And also the stage of development, adult development. Teachers sometimes function in the concrete to the formal, moving to post-formal, this development continuum. And this is also important in the fourth follow-up, because you are going to need to look at the teacher and identify her experiences, background, and development in order to determine what would work best to support the teacher. And again, this gives you the reason why you should just double check and read the material in Chapter 4. Another way to look at it is the conceptual development continuum. If someone is functioning on a low concept level, they're in the concrete area where they just want to be told what to do and they need to know exactly what the concrete parameters are. That would be like a new teacher. Moderate, where they're moderate abstract thinking and they might be thinking a little bit more broad-based, versus the higher level of abstract where you're moving above and beyond toward the leadership continuum. Also, moral development continuum is something you should look into in the chapter, and then this comes from typical psychology background with Piaget and Freud, your ego development, fearful, moving to conforming, versus autonomous. And then also levels of consciousness is another continuum that you can consider. And then your concern continuum, when we face so much with teachers and change, what is their ability to be self-adequate versus the teaching task versus moving to their impact level. Additionally, you need to consider the adult life cycle in development, and when you're working with your teams of coaches, teams of faculty members, think about where they are in adulthood, whether they are in early adulthood, young, middle, or later, and some of the additional parameters that impact them during these adult life cycle development events. Transition events are also something that should be considered. We function very much with age graded, but as you get to adulthood, there's not necessarily a timeline and things can happen. Also history graded, like the death of a parent, birth of a child, and then keeping in time these various things that impact your work. Role development, this is drawn to show that there should be a balance between work, family and life, and personal development, although rhetorically I would suggest that you think about where you function and also your faculty, understanding if you're working with someone who maybe spends more towards work, less towards family and life, or when things shift and maybe there's something going on at home, you need to consider that when you're working with adults, same as we would with children. Also thinking about race and ethnicity in a development, which is important because we do bring different background, cultural norms, experiences, and we all need to work together much as the same as your classroom. Then when you're looking at the supervisory behaviors, we have direct supervision, where you're essentially taking the lead, you're informing, you're directing, you want to assess competencies. When you're in the collaborative role, it's the give and take problem solving, and you want to be an equal member and a participant. And then the non-directive is where you're really letting the teacher do the work because you have confidence in their abilities. So think about this as being a continuum that is a sliding scale. Sometimes you might have to be directive. Many times you want to be collaborative. And if there is the expertise, you want to aspire to be non-directive, which is what Glickman lays out in his text. When you think about directive, collaborative, and non-directive, it's important. It goes back to your philosophy, things that we discussed in the very beginning of the course, essential, experimental, and existential. And this is just showing you if you are directive as a supervisor, it's high on your end, low input from the teacher, responsibility. Collaborative should be at the equal level. Supervisor is low in the non-directive because you have high responsibility and accountability for the teacher in this non-directive norm. Want to think about culture, what's going on in your school, in your program, in your athletic team, looking at beliefs, background, influences, because that is not something that can be ignored, and all of those pieces play into the environment in which you're leading. And a little bit on Chapter 6 to kind of go back to this continuum. So there are these behaviors that are supervisory behaviors that Glickman lists in the chapter, in which they come out into a certain order depending on the behavior that you're using. So if you are directive, you're going to be using more of the directing stance and possibly less of the listening. If you're in collaborative, maybe you're in the presenting and the negotiating and problem-solving mode. If you're non-directive, then you're going to be more on the listening and clarifying because you're allowing the teacher or the coach to take the lead, and you're going to be less on directing and standardizing. So each of these is laid out in the chapters that follow that explain the various parts of the continuum. Again, another visual to look at it. So non-directive, showing that it's high on the teacher's ability, low on the supervisor. As you move down the scale, collaborative should be equal teacher, equal supervisor. Directive informational is higher on the supervisor, but the informational piece you're giving, let's say option A, B, or C. So you're directing, but there is a little bit of buy-in. Directive control is more just the supervisor, much less on the teacher. You're basically directing them what to do. And this, of course, can apply in a relationship or in your family dynamic as well, whether you're collaborating where you might want to go for dinner, you're directing informationally, oh, do you want to go Chinese or Italian, or you're just saying, let's go Italian. Or, it doesn't matter to me, non-directive, go where you want to go. So just that's a simple analogy to think about it, and that is this sliding scale, which is why we call it a continuum. So when you're having these conferences, which you've done in follow-up 2 and follow-up 3, you have to select the approach, and you're going to talk more about that again in follow-up 4. So you want to have your approach determined, which of course can shift and change during the conference. And then you want to think about the outcome. Is the teacher basically putting the plan together or leading it? Is it a mutual plan? Is it something that you have suggested, which is informational, or you've actually required and determined, or possibly a combination of any of those? This is always interesting just as a supervisor or a leader or coach or teacher, is this Johari window. So you want to keep in mind, in the public self, this is what you know, and this is what the teachers see about you. In the private self, this is what you know, but you choose not to reveal to the teacher. The blind self are things that possibly teachers or your students notice about you, but you are not aware. Maybe you have a nervous habit, a tic, a movement, something, but they notice that, you don't know. Unknown self, the fourth pane of the window, teachers are not aware if you're a leader and you're not aware. So it's important to think about what you put in your public self and then what you choose to keep in your private. What's also important to grow as a leader is to understand this blind self if things are shared to you or with you, because you may want to consider those as you grow and develop as a leader. What that brings up is this term of cognitive dissonance, because this is saying that there's possibly this disagreement where possibly you think you're a good listener and then your staff or your teachers or whoever it is say that you're not. Do you accept that, or do you work to change that? So these are some things to think about when you're self-assessing your performance, your satisfaction, dissatisfaction, how things are going, to kind of think about that and move forward. In development supervision, what we're thinking of is the phases, as I've talked to you about the different pieces on the continuum. You need to then, as the supervisor, determine the teacher's developmental level, their expertise and commitment. The developmental level, this will come from Chapter 4, as we've discussed earlier in this video, their level of expertise and commitment, whether it's a teacher or a coach. Then you determine the approach that you're going to use to match for the supervisory connection. You select that, and then you work on that with the teacher, and then where appropriate, you want to move to less supervisor control and more on the teacher.